The Hindenburg disaster is a tragedy that mirrors the Titanic disaster in its level of intrigue, infamy, and notoriety. As the airship hit the ground in a flaming heap, it left behind a burning pile of just as many questions. What caused the ignition? How did this happen? And could this happen today? She fell from the sky in just over 30 seconds, leaving behind a crowd of panicked witnesses, badly burned survivors, and charred bodies and splatters on the pavement. This is part 2 of our coverage of the Hindenburg, so if you haven't seen part 1, make sure to check it out on our second channel, Aviation Disasters Explained. If you've seen it, let's continue. Of the 97 aboard, there were 35 deaths. 13 of 36 passengers were killed, and 22 of the 61 crew perished in the blaze. Among the dead was also one ground crewman, civilian linesman Alan Hagman, who perished looking up at the Hindenburg and securing the mooring lines. 10 passengers and 16 crewmen died in the crash or in the fire. The majority of victims burned to death. However, some died jumping from the airship to escape the blaze as a consequence of smoke inhalation or from falling debris. 6 other crew members, 3 passengers, and Alan Hagman on the ground died in the following hours or days, mostly as a result from severe burns. The majority of the crew that were killed were up inside the ship's hull, where they either did not have a clear escape route or were close to the bow of the ship, which hung burning in the air for too long for most of them to escape. Most of the crew in the bow died in the fire, although at least one was filmed falling from the bow to his death. Most of the passengers who died were trapped in the starboard side of the passenger deck. Not only was the wind blowing the fire toward the starboard side, but the ship also rolled slightly to starboard as it settled to the ground, with much of the upper hull on that part of the ship collapsing outboard of the starboard observation windows, thus cutting off escape of many of the passengers on that side. To make matters worse, the sliding door leading from the starboard passenger area to the central foyer and the gangway stairs was jammed shut during the crash, further trapping the passengers on the starboard side. Nonetheless, some did manage to escape from the starboard passenger decks. By contrast, all but a few of the passengers on the port side were able to escape. Although it is the most well-known airship disaster, it is far from being the worst. Just over twice as many had perished when the helium-filled U.S. Navy scout airship USS Akron crashed at sea off the New Jersey coast 4 years earlier on April 4, 1933, killing 73 of 76 on board. Of the 12 crew in the bow of the airship, only 3 survived. 4 of the 12 men were standing on the mooring shelf, a platform up at the very tip of the bow, from which the forwardmost landing ropes and the steel mooring cable were released to the ground crew, and which was directly at the forward end of the axial walkway and just ahead of gas cell 16. The rest were standing either along the lower keel walkway ahead of the control car, or else on platforms beside the stairway leading up the curve of the bow to the mooring shelf. During the fire, the bow hung in the air at roughly a 45-degree angle and flames shot forward through the axial walkway, bursting through the bow like a blowtorch. The 3 who survived were furthest aft of the bow, and 2 of them happened to be standing near 2 large triangular air vents, through which cool air was being drawn by the fire. Neither of these men sustained more than superficial burns. Most of the men standing along the bow stairway either fell aft into the fire or tried to leap from the ship when it was still too high in the air. 3 of the 4 men standing on the mooring shelf inside the very tip of the bow were actually taken from the wreck alive, though they died shortly after. Although hydrogen fires are incredibly powerful, they are less destructive to immediate surroundings than gasoline explosions because of the buoyancy of diatomic hydrogen, which causes the heat of combustion to be released upwards more than circumferentially as the leaked mass ascends in the atmosphere. Hydrogen fires are more survivable than fires of gasoline or wood. The hydrogen in the Hindenburg burned out within 90 seconds. Rest in peace to all of those who died in this horrific incident, and may they rest easy. So we know how many died and what happened to them, but how did the fires start? Well, we really don't know, and most current analyses of the fire assume ignition due to some form of electricity as the cause. However, there are numerous interesting hypotheses to consider. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. At the time of the disaster, sabotage was commonly put forward as the cause of the fire, initially proposed by Hugo Echner, former head of the Zeppelin Company and the, quote, old man of German airships. However, the more he learned about it, the more he endorsed the static electricity theory. Captain Max Pruss, who survived the crash and piloted her throughout her short-lived career, believed it to be sabotage. Why? He'd flew on nearly every flight of the Graf Zeppelin since 1928 until the Hindenburg's launch in 1936, and in a 1960 interview, he said early airship travel was safe, and therefore he strongly believed that sabotage was to blame. He said that on numerous trips to South America, a popular destination for German tourists, both airships passed through thunderstorms and were struck by lightning but remained unharmed. Most members of the crew refused to believe one of them would commit such an act, and so they point their fingers to different passengers, some with odd backgrounds and others with political motivations. Some even believe that Adolf Hitler himself ordered the destruction of the Hindenburg. However, the sabotage theory is purely speculative at this point, as there is little hard-proven evidence to point to this conclusion. Echner argued that the fire was started by an electric spark, which was caused by a buildup of static electricity on the airship. The spark would have ignited hydrogen on the outer skin, and the rest of the airship would have gone up like a tinderbox. Proponents of the static spark hypothesis point out that the airship's skin was not constructed in a way that allowed its charge to be distributed evenly throughout the craft. The skin was separated from the duralumin frame by non-conductive Ramey cords, which had been lightly covered in metal to improve conductivity, but not very effectively, allowing a large difference in potential to form between the skin and the frame. Not only this, but to make up for lost time, the Hindenburg passed through a weather front of high humidity and high electrical charge. Although the mooring lines weren't wet when they first hit the ground and ignition took place 4 minutes later, Echner theorized that they may have become wet in these 4 minutes. When the ropes, which were connected to the frame, became wet, they would have grounded the frame but not the skin. This would have caused a sudden potential difference between the skin and the frame and would have set off an electrical discharge, one lone spark. Seeking the quickest way to ground, the spark would have jumped from the skin onto the metal framework, igniting the leaking hydrogen. There's also the possibility of a lightning strike. Like many other aircraft, the Hindenburg had been struck by lightning several times in its years of operation. This does not normally ignite a fire in hydrogen-filled airships due to the lack of oxygen. However, airship fires have been observed when lightning strikes the vehicle as it vents hydrogen as ballast in preparation for landing. The vented hydrogen mixes with the oxygen in the atmosphere, creating a combustible mixture. The Hindenburg was venting hydrogen at the time of the disaster. However, witnesses did not observe any lightning storms as the ship made its final approach. Yet another interesting theory is that the doping compound of the airship, or the paint on the outside of it, was the cause of the fire, and this was proposed in 1996 by retired NASA scientist Addison Bain. This would mean the Hindenburg could have burned even if it was filled with helium. The hypothesis is limited to the source of ignition and to the flame front propagation, not to the source of most of the burning material, as once the fire started and spread, the hydrogen clearly must have burned. The incendiary paint hypothesis asserts that the major component in starting the fire and feeding its spread was the canvas skin because of the compound used on it. Proponents of this hypothesis argue that the coatings on the fabric contained both iron oxide and aluminum-impregnated cellulose acetate butyrate, which remain potentially reactive even after fully setting. Iron oxide and aluminum can be used as components of solid rocket fuel or thermite. However, the coating applied to the Hindenburg's covering did not have a sufficient quantity of any material capable of acting as an oxidizer, which is a necessary component of rocket fuel. However, oxygen is also available from the air. Even the Mythbusters put it to the test. Though their findings did indicate the aluminum and iron oxide ratios in the Hindenburg skin were certainly flammable, they were not enough on their own to destroy the Hindenburg. Had the skin contained enough metal to produce pure thermite, the Zeppelin could not have flown. So, this being the sole or main cause of the accident is unlikely. And though there are other potential theories, the last one we will cover today is the puncture theory. Although Captain Press believed that the Hindenburg could withstand tight turns without significant damage, proponents of the puncture hypothesis, including Hugo Echner, questioned the airship's structural integrity after being repeatedly stressed over its flight record. The airship did not receive much in the way of routine inspections, even though there was evidence of at least some damage on previous flights. It is not known whether that damage was properly repaired or even whether all the failures had been found. During the ship's first return flight from Rio, Hindenburg had once lost an engine and almost drifted over Africa, where it could have crashed. Afterwards, Echner ordered section chiefs to inspect the airship during flight. However, the complexity of the Hindenburg would make it virtually impossible to detect all weaknesses within the structure. In March of 1936, the Hindenburg and the Graf Zeppelin made 3-day flights to draw fleet flips and broadcast speeches via loudspeaker. Before takeoff on March 26, 1936, Ernst Lehmann chose to launch her with the wind blowing from behind her instead of into the wind as per standard procedure. During the takeoff, her tail struck the ground, and part of the lower fin was broken. Although that damage was repaired, the force of the impact may have caused internal damage. Only 6 days before the disaster, it was planned to make the Hindenburg have a hook on her hull to carry aircraft, similar to the U.S. Navy's use of the USS Akron and USS Macon airships. However, the trials were unsuccessful as the biplane hit the Hindenburg's trapeze several times. The structure of the airship might have been further affected here. Newsreels show that the Hindenburg made numerous sharp turns, first to port and then starboard, just before the accident. Proponents posit that either of these turns could have weakened the structure near the vertical fins, causing a bracing wire to snap and puncture at least one of the internal gas cells. Additionally, some of the bracing wires may have even been substandard. One bracing wire tested after the crash broke at a mere 70% of its rated load. A punctured cell would have freed hydrogen into the air and could have been ignited by static discharge, or it is also possible that the broken bracing wire struck a girder, causing sparks to ignite the hydrogen. When the fire started, people on board the airship reported hearing a muffled detonation, but outside, a ground crew member on the starboard side reported hearing a crack. Some speculate the sound was from a bracing wire snapping. I personally subscribe to this conclusion. Echner has said that the puncture hypothesis due to pilot error was the most likely explanation for the disaster. He held Captains Pruss and Lehmann responsible for what he viewed as a rushed landing procedure with the airship badly out of trim under poor weather conditions. However, the apparent stern heaviness during the landing approach was noticed 30 minutes before the landing approach, indicating that a gas leak resulting from a sharp turn did not cause the initial stern heaviness. As publicized as the Hindenburg disaster is, it remains an utter mystery, baffling anyone who dares to stop and truly look at it. No matter how you spin it, no matter what theory you believe, 35 people still died, and that is the most important takeaway here. So what do you think happened?